Hello, dear readers. Welcome to another moving narrative that crosses centuries to touch our hearts today. The story we're about to share is about rejection, hope, and the miraculous power of true love to transform lives. It's about a girl who carried within herself the pain of 7 rejections, but found in the 8th attempt not just a family, but the redemption of 2 wounded souls. A journey that teaches us that sometimes we need to be broken to become whole again. Before we begin, tell us here in the comments, from which city are you watching us? We love to know where our dear listeners come from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us tremendously to continue bringing these stories that warm the soul and make us reflect on the beauty of life, even in its most challenging moments. Year 1879. Location: Santo Amaro da Purificação, Recôncavo Bahiano. The girl of 7 families. The orphanage of Nossa Senhora das Mercês emanated the permanent aroma of beeswax and whispered prayers, as if the ancient stones kept in their cracks all the requests directed to heaven by children who dreamed of homes. It was October 1879, and the Bahian mornings arrived wrapped in a golden mist that made the shadows of the ipé trees dance in the central courtyard. Esperanza dos Santos, at 13 years old, carried on her thin shoulders the invisible weight of 7 rejections. Each family that had received her left a subtle mark on her, like footprints in the sand that time had not managed to completely erase. Sitting on a stone bench under the centennial fig tree, she kept close to her chest a small trunk of light wood, the only vestige of Rosa, her mother, who had departed taken by cholera when Esperanza's world still fit in the palm of a hand. The trunk contained treasures invisible to the eye, a rag doll with a faded face, yellowed letters that she couldn't read, a metal brooch that had once been golden, and a handkerchief that still held, almost imperceptibly, the lavender perfume that Rosa used on Sundays. For Esperanza, that small box was an entire kingdom, the only place in the world where she truly belonged. Mother Joaquina observed the girl from the window of her office, her heart tight with a compassion that grew each day. She knew by memory the story of that child. The first family, the German Pereiras, had returned her, because Donna Greta cried every night seeing in her the ghost of her dead daughter. The second, the Barbosas, wanted a servant, not a daughter, and discovered that Esperanza read too much and dreamed too loudly. The Albuquerques treated her as a servant for 3 long months, until their own shame made them bring her back. The Silvers considered her too melancholic for a house that needed laughter. The Nascimentos, prosperous freed blacks, didn't accept her mixed skin. The Costas, French teachers, didn't know how to deal with her nightmares. And lastly, the Drummonds, sugar barons, where she was humiliated by their daughter Eugenia, who called her the yellowish bastard. 7 families. 7 attempts to find a place in the world. 7 doors that closed, always leaving her with the same trunk in her hands, and her heart a little more shrunken. The other children of the orphanage played in the distance, but Esperanza preferred the solitude of the fig tree, not out of contempt for the others, but because she had learned that not belonging hurt less when one was alone. Her fingers traced the worn wood of the trunk in a caress that was almost a silent prayer. It was then that she heard footsteps on the stone. Someone approached with the heavy cadence of one who carried the world on his shoulders, but without haste, like someone who had learned that there are pains that cannot be hurried. Esperanza raised her eyes and saw a tall man, with dark hair touched by the silver of early snow, wearing simple but good quality clothes. His brown eyes had the same color as earth after rain, deep, melancholic, but with a sweetness that she immediately recognized. The man stopped a few steps away, without forcing proximity, and his eyes found the trunk she was holding. "Is it heavy?" he asked, with a voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well but without harshness. Esperanza looked at him steadily for a moment before responding, "Not so much. These are just the things that remained from my mother." He nodded, as if he understood perfectly the weight of things that remain. There was something about that man that made her feel that he too carried an invisible trunk, perhaps even heavier than hers. "We all have things we keep," he said, sitting on the edge of the bench, respecting her space. "Sometimes they're the only proof that love existed." And in that moment, under the centennial fig tree, 2 wounded souls recognized each other without needing more words. Esperanza didn't know yet, but she had just found the 8th family, the one that wouldn't reject her, because it also needed to be found. How would that casual encounter forever change the destiny of both? João Batista de Almeida was a man haunted by the ghosts of his own wasted tenderness. At 45 years old, He carried in the premature wrinkles around his eyes, the cartography of losses that no map could describe. A veteran of the Paraguayan War, he had learned on the battlefields that life is fragile as glass and precious as gold, but that lesson had come too late to save those he loved most. The Santa Esperanza estate extended over 600 alqueires of generous land, where cacao and sugarcane alternated in rows that seemed like verses of a pastoral poem. But all that abundance had turned to ash since 1876, when death visited his house twice in the same year, first taking little Antonio, barely 6 years old, victim of yellow fever, and then Serafina, his wife, who departed giving birth to a son who never even breathed. João Batista's mornings always began in the estate's private chapel, where 3 white crosses marked presences that became absences. He conversed with them in whispers, telling about the harvest, about difficult decisions, about the loneliness that grew like weeds in every corner of the big house. Tia Firmina, his former wet nurse and now housekeeper, observed those morning conversations with a broken heart, knowing that her boy, for to her Juan Batista would always be the boy she had raised, was slowly drowning in a melancholy that not all the gold in the world could cure. The estate functioned like a living organism under the care of Benedito Livre, a former slave whom João Batista had freed in 1877, 2 years before the visit that would change everything. Benedito was a wise man, with calloused hands and an immense heart, who understood without words his master's pain because he too knew the bitter taste of loss. His daughter Florinda, 12 years old, was the only young presence on the estate, and even so she kept respectfully distant from the big house, sensing that certain sorrows needed silence to heal. On the afternoon before the visit to the orphanage, João Batista walked through the empty corridors of the house, where every piece of furniture seemed to cry out for the absence of those who should be there. The room that had been Antonio's remained untouched, with toys organized on the dresser as if awaiting the return of small hands. The conjugal room, where Serafina had embroidered dreams on linen quilts, remained closed like a mausoleum of interrupted hopes. It was Father Anselmo, parish vicar and longtime friend, who suggested the visit to the orphanage, not with the intention of adoption, that would be unthinkable for a man who considered himself dead while living, but as a way to channel his melancholy into Christian charity. João Batista had agreed merely to silence the priest's well-intentioned insisting, without imagining that that visit would be the first step of a journey back to life. The night before the visit was marked by a recurring dream that had tormented him since Serafina's death. In the dream, he walked through a garden where all the flowers were withered, but in the distance he saw a small seedling that insisted on sprouting between the stones. He always woke before reaching it, with an accelerated heart and the sensation that something important was about to happen. On that October morning, while preparing for the visit, João Batista looked in the mirror and saw reflected a stranger, prematurely graying hair, eyes that had lost their shine, shoulders curved by the weight of carrying all sorrows alone. Tia Firmina entered the room without asking permission, a privilege earned through decades of dedication, and adjusted his tie with the same tenderness as always. "You need fresh air," she murmured, without raising her eyes. "This house is becoming too small for so much nostalgia." Juan Batista didn't respond, but something inside him stirred for the first time in a long while. Perhaps it was the season. October had always been Serafina's favorite month, when the ipé trees bloomed like golden candelabras throughout the estate. Or perhaps it was just the fatigue of carrying alone a burden that was becoming too heavy, even for his broad shoulders. When he arrived at the orphanage, accompanied by Father Anselmo, João Batista expected merely to fulfill a social obligation, make his donation, and leave. He didn't expect his eyes to be immediately drawn to a solitary figure under the centennial fig tree, a girl with light brown skin, dark hair caught in a simple braid, who held against her chest a small trunk as if it contained all the treasures in the world. There was something about that child that made him stop. Perhaps it was the way she kept her spine straight despite the evident melancholy, or the manner in which her fingers caressed the trunk with a tenderness he recognized. It was the same tenderness with which he touched Antonio's and Serafina's objects, the desperate tenderness of one who tries to keep memory alive through touch. In that moment, João Batista didn't yet know that he had just found the only person in the world capable of understanding his silent language of pain, and that together they would undertake the most improbable of journeys, the mutual healing of two souls that considered themselves lost forever. Could it be possible that two such wounded people could save each other? The conversation under the fig tree lasted only 20 minutes, but it was enough for two wounded souls to recognize each other. João Batista found himself speaking with a naturalness he hadn't felt in years, telling the girl about the estate, about the cacao groves that bloomed even in the driest seasons, about the birds that built nests in the crowns of ancient trees. Esperanza listened to him with attention that went beyond courtesy. It was as if each word of his found echo in her own experience of solitude. When she told him, in a low but firm voice, about the 7 families that didn't want her, João Batista felt a pang in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time, the pain of seeing someone suffer who didn't deserve it. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Both knew the bitter taste of rejection, though in different flavors. "Do you know what I learned about the things we keep?" he said, pointing delicately toward the trunk. "They only have value when we share their stories with someone who understands them." Esperanza raised her eyes to him, and in that moment, João Batista saw something that surprised him. There was no bitterness in that child, despite everything she had suffered. There was sadness, yes, and fatigue, but also a silent dignity that moved him deeply. When it came time to leave, João Batista hesitated. Rationality screamed that this was just another charity visit, but something deeper whispered that leaving that girl there would be an irreparable mistake. It was then that he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Esperanza," he said, savoring the name as if it were the first time he pronounced it. "Would you like to spend a few weeks at the estate? Not as—" he hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not like the other times, just to know a different place, no promises, no obligations." She studied him with eyes that seemed too old for a 13-year-old face, as if weighing not just his words, but also his soul. "And if you decide you don't want me either?" she asked with an honesty that completely disarmed him. João Batista knelt to her height so that their eyes were on the same level. "Then you'll return here with the same trunk, the same memories, and nothing will have changed, except that you'll have known a place where no one will ever make you feel unwanted. That I can promise you." The conversation with Mother Joaquina took place in the office that smelled of candle wax and ancient hopes. The nun had known João Batista since he was a boy, knew about his losses, about his reputation as an honorable man. But she also knew Esperanza, knew about her fragility disguised as strength. "Colonel," she said, carefully choosing her words, "this girl has already suffered too much with unfulfilled expectations. She needs stability, not another experiment." "It's not an experiment, Mother, it's—" He stopped, seeking to understand his own feelings. "It's a need I can't explain. Perhaps she needs a place to belong, and perhaps I need someone for whom that place matters." The negotiation was delicate. Mother Joaquina imposed conditions, regular visits, reports on the girl's welfare, and the guarantee that, at the slightest sign of inadequacy, Esperanza would return to the orphanage without additional trauma. João Batista agreed to everything, knowing that his motivation went far beyond Christian charity, though he still couldn't name it. When Esperanza learned of the decision, her first reaction was fear. 7 families had taught her that expectations inevitably led to disappointment, but there was something different about that man with sad eyes who had spoken to her as an equal, not as a child to be molded or fixed. On the morning of departure, she carefully organized her few belongings: 3 simple but clean dresses, Sunday shoes, some books she had received from a benefactor, and, of course, her mother's trunk. Mother Joaquina blessed her at the orphanage door, whispering a prayer that sounded more like a desperate plea than a blessing. The journey to the Santa Esperanza estate was made in a comfortable carriage, pulled by 2 bay horses that knew the way by heart. João Batista respected Esperanza's silence, understanding that changes, even desired ones, require time to be digested. She kept the trunk in her lap, watching the landscape gradually transform from urban to rural, from cramped houses to open fields. When they spotted the estate in the distance, the 2-story big house surrounded by gardens where ipe trees and flamboyants created a symphony of colors, Esperanza felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: curiosity. Not the anxious expectation that had accompanied her in other attempts, but a serene curiosity about what awaited her in that place that seemed to have emerged from a dream. Tia Fermina waited for them on the veranda, a middle-aged black woman whose face radiated a kindness that needed no words to express itself. Benedito Livre held the horse's reins with hands that spoke of honest work and earned dignity. And there, half hidden behind a column, Florinda observed the arrival of the new girl with the natural curiosity of someone who hadn't seen another child around for a long time. When Esperanza stepped down from the carriage, still holding her trunk, and her feet touched the red earth of the estate, she didn't yet know that she had just arrived at the first place in the world where she would be truly welcome. But there was something in the air, a perfume of flowers she couldn't name, the distant sound of running water, the sensation of amplitude that only open spaces provide, that told her, whispering softly in her heart, that perhaps, just perhaps, the 8th attempt could be different. Would that estate be the home Esperanza was looking for, or just another illusion destined to break? The first days at the Santa Esperanza estate passed in a delicate dance of cautious approaches and respectful silences. Esperanza was installed in the room that had once belonged to Antonio, but João Batista had carefully removed all the masculine toys, replacing them with neutral furniture that carried no alien memories. The room's window faced the orchard, where centennial orange trees created a perfumed canopy that filtered morning light into golden fragments. Tia Firmina, with the wisdom of someone who had raised many children throughout her life, didn't try to force intimacy. She prepared girls' favorite meals: tapioca porridge with coconut milk, chicken broth with okra, papaya sweet with cloves, and left them discreetly in the room, accompanied by flowers picked from the garden. It was her silent way of saying "you are welcome," without using words that might frighten. Esperanza spent mornings cautiously exploring the estate's spaces, always carrying her trunk like a protective talisman. She discovered Serafina's library, where hundreds of books slumbered on jacaranda shelves, awaiting readers who could restore them to life. She found the rose garden that no one else tended, where flowers grew wild among weeds, creating a melancholic beauty that touched her heart. João Batista observed her from a distance, learning her habits like a patient naturalist. He noticed she liked to sit on the veranda during late afternoon, when golden light transformed the estate into an impressionist painting. He perceived that her eyes lit up in the library, that her fingers caressed book spines with the same tenderness she devoted to her mother's trunk. He saw that she avoided the chapel, probably by instinct, knowing that pains that didn't belong to her resided there. The first real conversation happened on a rainy morning when Esperanza was found on the veranda contemplating the drops that transformed earth into perfume. João Batista approached with 2 cups of coffee with milk and offered her one, sitting in a nearby but non-invasive chair. "Rain always made me thoughtful," he commented, without looking directly at her. "It's as if it washed not only the earth, but also thoughts." Esperanza accepted the cup, warming her hands on the hot clay. "My mother used to say that rain was God talking to us," she murmured, the first personal information she shared spontaneously. "That each drop carried a word that only our heart knew how to translate." "Your mother was wise," said João Batista, and there was so much sincerity in his voice that Esperanza looked at him for the first time without distrust. "You also lost important people, didn't you?" she asked with the sharpened perception of one who knew intimately the geography of loss. He nodded slowly, without haste to respond. When he did, his voice carried the weight of long-kept confessions. "I lost my son and my wife. Since then, this house became too big for one man alone." Esperanza studied him for a moment, recognizing in him the same loneliness that had accompanied her since Rosa departed. "Sometimes I think the people we love don't die completely," she said, surprising herself with her own courage. "They just move to a place inside us that no one else can reach." It was in that moment that João Batista understood that it wasn't just an orphaned child he had brought to his house. It was an old soul in a young body, someone who understood the complexities of human pain better than many adults. And for the first time in years, he felt less alone in the world. The following days brought small progress. Esperanza began accompanying João Batista on his morning rounds of the estate, staying a few steps behind but showing genuine interest in the property's functioning. She learned the workers' names, the cacao flowering season, the secrets for identifying when sugarcane was at the ideal harvesting point. Benedito Livre became her first non-family ally, teaching her about medicinal plants that grew in the back of the property, showing her how to identify different animal tracks in damp earth. Florinda, initially shy, began approaching during afternoons, offering to show the best places to pick fruit or observe birds. Tia Firmina discovered that Esperanza could read and write with fluency, rare for a girl of her social origin, and began bringing books from the library to her room, creating a small pile of literature that grew each day. It was through books that Esperanza communicated with the world, and having free access to them represented a luxury she had never imagined possible. But not everything was progress. Night still brought nightmares. Moments when Esperanza woke calling for Mainha Rosa, with an anguished voice that crossed the big house walls. João Batista, who also suffered from insomnia since his losses, heard those calls and remained in his hammock on the veranda, respecting her pain but staying available in case she needed human presence. One morning, after a particularly difficult night, João Batista found Esperanza in the kitchen even before Tia Firmina awoke, trying to prepare her own coffee with trembling hands from fatigue. Without saying a word, he took over the task, preparing a strong coffee scented with cinnamon, and sat at the rustic wooden table where family meals took place. "Do nightmares visit you too?" she asked, recognizing in his eyes the same exhaustion she felt. "Almost every night," he confessed. "I dream I'm searching for them, but I never manage to find them in time. I dream that Mama is calling me, but when I run to find her, I wake up and she's nowhere," said Esperanza, and for the first time her tears came without shame. João Batista extended a clean handkerchief to her, and in that simple gesture there was more tenderness than she had received from any of the previous families. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we can help each other carry those dreams. Sometimes a shared weight becomes lighter, and so between morning confessions and shared coffee, between estate walks and nights of understood nightmares, Esperanza and João Batista began building something that neither knew how to name yet, but both recognized as the beginning of mutual healing. How would those first bonds of trust resist the test of time and ancient wounds not yet healed? The first true test of the new dynamic came on a December morning when Tia Firmina, in her kind intention to organize, tidied Esperanza's room while the girl walked with João Batista through the blooming cacao groves. Among other things, she carefully organized the contents of her mother's trunk, arranging the objects on a small shelf so they would look prettier and more aired. When Esperanza returned and found her trunk empty, her treasures exposed like curiosities in a showcase, something inside her broke again. It wasn't just the violation of her privacy, it was the terrible sensation that even there, in that place she had begun to feel safe, she had no right to the inviolability of her memories. João Batista found her sitting on the room floor, obsessively reorganizing the objects back into the trunk, tears falling silently on her mother's yellowed letters. He immediately understood what had happened without needing explanations, and felt controlled fury against himself for not having instructed Tia Firmina about the girl's sacred boundaries. "Forgive me," he said, kneeling beside her. "I should have explained that some things are untouchable. I'll talk to Tia Firmina, but the fault is mine." Esperanza stopped arranging the objects and looked at him with eyes that seemed very old. "It's not your fault. It's just that—" She hesitated, searching for words for feelings too complex. "This trunk is all that's left from when I had a mother. When other people touch it, it's like they're touching her, and I can't protect her because she's no longer here to protect herself." The explanation touched João Batista unexpectedly. He thought of his own need to keep Serafina's room and Antonio's objects untouched, understanding that they both practiced the same silent religion of preservation. "I understand completely," he said with a sincerity she felt. "I also have things that are only mine to touch. I'll explain this to the whole house, and I promise it will never happen again." The conversation with Tia Firmina was delicate but necessary. The housekeeper, initially hurt by having her good intentions misinterpreted, soon understood when João Batista explained the situation using analogies she could understand. Like all people who had loved and lost, Tia Firmina knew the importance of private rituals of memory. From that day forward, an unwritten rule was established in the house. Esperanza's trunk was sacred territory, just like Serafina's closed room and Antonio's preserved objects. Everyone had the right to their particular altars of nostalgia. The incident curiously brought Esperanza and João Batista even closer. She perceived that he had not only respected her pain, but actively defended her, something none of the other families had done. He discovered that protecting her gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in years, a reason to emerge from the melancholic lethargy that consumed him. The following weeks brought a stability that Esperanza had never experienced. Her mornings began with shared coffee on the veranda, where she and João Batista discussed the books she read, the dreams they'd had, the small events of the estate. He discovered she had a sharp intelligence and surprising perception about human nature, probably sharpened by her experiences of rejection. Afternoons were dedicated to exploration. Esperanza accompanied João Batista on his property inspections, learning about agriculture, rural administration, animal care. He explained each process with infinite patience, and she absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbs rain. Benedito Livre commented to Tia Firmina that he had never seen the master so animated when explaining the estate's functioning. It was during one of those afternoons that the second important milestone occurred. Juan Bautista was teaching Esperanza to identify different varieties of cacao when she suddenly developed a high fever. What began as discomfort quickly transformed into smallpox, a disease feared in the region. For 3 days and 3 nights, Esperanza was between life and death. Juan Bautista didn't leave her room, alternating with Tia Firmina in care, applying cold compresses, forcing her to drink water and medicinal teas. During feverish delirium, she called for Rosa, for Juan Bautista, mixing past and present in a confusion that broke the heart of whoever watched. On the 3rd night, when the fever finally broke and Esperanza opened lucid eyes for the first time, the first thing she saw was Juan Bautista sleeping in a chair beside her bed, unshaven and in wrinkled clothes from someone who hadn't moved from there for days. "Did you stay here the whole time?" she asked in a weak voice. He woke immediately, as if his subconscious were programmed to detect any change in her condition. "Where else would I be?" he responded, as if the question made no sense. It was in that moment that something fundamental resolved in Esperanza's heart. 7 families had returned her at the slightest sign of inconvenience, but that man had spent 3 days watching over her sleep, as if she were his own daughter. The word godfather began forming in her mind, still too shy to be pronounced. Convalescence lasted 2 weeks, during which Juan Bautista brought her books, told estate stories, made small paper origami to distract her. Tia Firmina prepared nutritious broths and special desserts. Florinda picked flowers to decorate the room. Benedito Livre carved small wooden animals to entertain the sick girl. It was as if the entire estate had mobilized to care for her, and Esperanza experienced for the first time in life the sensation of being truly important to someone. Not as an object of charity or social experiment, but as a beloved person whose absence would leave a real void. When she finally recovered completely in early January 1880, something had changed irreversibly. Juan Bautista was no longer just the man who had temporarily welcomed her. He had become her safe harbor. And she was no longer just an orphaned child he had sheltered out of compassion. She had become the daughter his heart had chosen. The first godfather came from her lips on a sunny morning, while they drank coffee on the veranda and watched Florinda play with a newborn kitten in the garden. Juan Bautista stopped stirring sugar in his coffee and looked at her with eyes that shone in a way she had never seen before. "Godfather?" he repeated, savoring the word. "If you don't mind," she said, suddenly shy. "It's just that, well, you've taken care of me like I imagine a father would." Juan Bautista put his cup on the table and extended his hand to her. When Esperanza held it, he squeezed it with the tenderness of someone who had finally found a treasure he thought was lost forever. "It would be an honor to be called that by you," he said, his voice choked with emotion that couldn't fit in words. And so on a golden January morning, under the perfume of blooming ipe trees and the song of bemtevi birds in the garden, a new family was born. Not from blood ties, but from the invisible threads that connect souls who recognize each other and choose to walk together. How would this new paternal relationship resist the challenges and transformations that the years would bring? The transformation of Esperanza into an official adopted daughter happened in a simple ceremony at the civil registry of Santo Amaro on a September morning in 1880, when she had turned 14. Juan Bautista wore his best white linen suit, and she wore a new blue cotton dress that Tia Firmina had sewn especially for the occasion. When the clerk asked for the miner's full name, Juan Bautista responded with pride, "Esperanza de Almeida Santos," maintaining Rosa's memory, but officially including her in his lineage. The signed paper was merely formality. Both their hearts had already made that adoption months before, but having the document meant legal security, protection, and mainly a surname that no one could question. Esperanza carried the paper inside her mother's trunk, beside the yellowed letters, as a bridge between her past and her future. Esperanza's formal education became a priority for Juan Bautista. He hired Mademoiselle Dubois, a French teacher who had established herself in the region after being widowed, to provide his daughter with the instruction that a young lady of her new social position should have. Esperanza proved to be an exceptional student, absorbing not only traditional subjects, Portuguese, French, mathematics, history, but also music, literature, and philosophy. Mademoiselle Dubois, a pragmatic 50-year-old woman with intelligent eyes and always busy hands, immediately recognized the girl's potential. In her letters to friends in Salvador, she wrote, "I found here a rare mind which could shine in any court salon if properly educated." It's a pity that birth circumstances still matter as much as they do. Esperanza's mornings were dedicated to formal studies, but afternoons continued to be for practical learning alongside João Batista. She learned about rural administration, basic accounting, crop management, animal care. João Batista discovered that teaching returned energy and purpose to him, and Esperanza discovered that learning was her natural way of existing in the world. At 15, Esperanza already mastered the estate's functioning better than many experienced administrators. She knew when cacao was ready for harvest by the color and sound it made when swaying in the wind. She could calculate in her head how much a reform in the sugar mill would cost. She personally knew each worker on the estate and their families. But her most precious education happened in evening conversations with João Batista, when they sat on the veranda and discussed everything from imperial politics to the novels she read. He discovered she had formed opinions about almost everything, always grounded in a solid morality that seemed innate. She discovered he was a much more cultured and sensitive man than he appeared, with knowledge about art, music, and literature that rivaled any intellectual from the capital. It was during one of those conversations that João Batista made the decision that would change Esperanza's future forever. She had just turned 16, and her education with Mademoiselle Dubois was reaching the limits of what a private teacher could offer on an interior estate. "Esperanza," he said on a particularly starry night, "would you like to study in Salvador?" The question took her by surprise. Salvador represented unimaginable opportunities, but also separation from the only true home she had known. "And leave you?" she asked, her heart already tight with the possibility. "For a short time. The Colegio da Soledade is excellent, and you have too much intelligence to be wasted here. Besides," he smiled with that tenderness she had learned to recognize, "an estate is always here waiting, but education opportunities pass and may not return." The decision wasn't easy. Esperanza felt divided between the desire to learn and the fear of losing what she had found. But João Batista was patient, explaining that investing in her education was the way to guarantee she would always have choices, that she would never depend on others' kindness to survive. "I want you to have independence," he said in one of their conversations. "Not because I plan to abandon you, but because an educated woman is a free woman. And after everything you've been through, you deserve all the freedom in the world." The departure for Salvador happened in March 1881, at the beginning of the school year. Esperanza took her mother's trunk, now accompanied by a suitcase of clothes, appropriate for a young society lady, and a small library that João Batista had carefully selected. The farewell was emotional but not definitive. They had established that she would return home for vacations and that they would correspond weekly. The Colegio da Soledad was a prestigious institution run by French nuns, where daughters of the Bahian elite received refined education. Esperanza was accepted not only for her academic ability, but also for the reputation and social position of João Batista, who was respected throughout the region. The first months were challenging. The other students, all from traditional families, initially treated her with coldness, not knowing how to classify an adopted orphan of humble origin. But Esperanza's intelligence and natural dignity soon earned respect, and her genuine kindness won some true friendships. The letters exchanged between her and João Batista became the link that kept their connection strong. He wrote about the estate, about harvests, about small changes in daily life. She wrote about studies, about intellectual discoveries, about the friends she made, but both correspondences were permeated with longing that words couldn't completely express. In 1882, at 17, Esperanza was already recognized as one of the best students in the school's history. She fluently mastered French and Latin, wrote poetry with mature sensitivity, understood philosophy and history with depth that impressed even the most erudite nuns. But her greatest achievement was staying true to herself, without letting formal education erase the natural kindness that made her special. During vacations, when she returned to the estate, João Batista could barely hide his pride. Esperanza returned more cultured, more elegant, but she was still the same girl he had welcomed under the orphanage fig tree. She still carried her mother's trunk with the same care, still sat with him on the veranda for conversations that lasted until late, still treated everyone on the estate with the same respectful consideration. It was during one of those vacations, at the end of 1883, that a conversation occurred that would define the future. Esperanza, now 18 years old and about to graduate, confessed to João Batista her decision. "I want to come home," she said one afternoon as they walked among the cacao groves. "Forever. But your opportunities in Salvador," he began. "My opportunities are here," she interrupted him with a conviction that surprised him. "I want to help administer the estate. I want to use my education to improve the workers' lives. I want to create a school for the region's children. I want to build something real, not just live an ornamental life in the capital." João Batista stopped walking and looked at her with eyes that shone with admiration. "Are you sure? I'm willing to support whatever choice you make." "I'm sure," she responded, smiling. "This land is mine now, too, and there's much work to be done here." When Esperanza graduated from the Colegio da Soledade in December 1884, she returned to the Santa Esperanza estate not as a visiting daughter, but as a woman ready to assume her role in building a legacy that would be remembered for generations. How would Esperanza use her refined education to transform life on the estate and realize the dreams she nurtured? Esperanza's definitive return to the estate in 1885 marked the beginning of an era of prosperity and innovation that would transform the Santa Esperanza estate into a model for the entire region. At 19 years old, she combined the refined education of the Colegio da Soledade with the practical wisdom learned alongside João Batista, creating a unique synthesis of knowledge and application. Her first initiative was creating a school for the estate workers' children. Using an old building that served as a warehouse, Esperanza organized a space where children could learn to read, write, and do basic arithmetic during mornings, before helping their families with afternoon tasks. She herself became the main teacher, applying modern pedagogical methods she had learned from the French nuns. João Batista observed these activities with growing admiration. The shy girl he had welcomed had transformed into a woman of vision, capable of dreaming big and realizing her dreams with practical determination. The school wasn't just charity, it was investment in the estate's future, training more qualified workers and creating a more educated community. It was during the school's organization that Esperanza met Dr. Carlos Mendez, a mulatto doctor from Salvador, who visited the region providing medical care to distant estates. Carlos, trained at the Bahia Faculty of Medicine, was a progressive 30-year-old man who believed medicine should serve everyone, not just the elite. Their first encounter happened when a flu epidemic struck the estate. Esperanza coordinated medical care, working side by side with Dr. Carlos to treat the sick and organize quarantine. He was impressed with her competence and practical knowledge of home medicine. She admired his dedication and absence of social prejudices. The courtship developed slowly, through conversations about medicine, education, and social improvement. Carlos discovered in Esperanza a woman who shared his progressive ideals. She found in him an intellectual companion who respected her independence and supported her projects. João Batista initially felt understandable paternal jealousy, but soon recognized in Carlos a man worthy of the daughter he had raised. When the doctor officially asked for Esperanza's hand in December 1885, João Batista gave his blessing with genuine joy. "She is a special woman," he told Carlos during the formal conversation. "She needs a man who understands that her strength is not a defect to be corrected, but a virtue to be celebrated." "That's exactly how I see her," Carlos responded. "As a partner, not as an ornament." The wedding was celebrated in May 1886 in the estate's chapel in a simple but moving ceremony. Esperanza wore the wedding dress that had been Serafina's, altered by Tia Firmina with all the care in the world. João Batista led her to the altar with tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of overflowing paternal pride. Father Anselmo, who had accompanied the entire journey since the orphanage, celebrated the ceremony, emphasizing how true love has the power to heal old wounds and create unimaginable futures. Benedito Livre and Tia Firmina cried as if it were their own daughter getting married. Florinda, now an 18-year-old young woman, served as maid of honor, moved to see the girl who had arrived shy and scared, transformed into a radiant bride. Carlos moved to the estate, establishing a medical clinic that served not only local workers, but the entire rural population of the surroundings. Esperanza continued pursuing her educational projects, now with her husband's medical support and the administrative experience she had developed alongside João Batista. The couple's first child was born in March 1887, a boy who received the name Antonio in honor of João Batista's lost son. When the adoptive grandfather held the baby for the first time, his tears were of gratitude for seeing life returning to circulate through the corridors of the house that had been empty for so long. The second daughter, Serafina, was born in January 1889, completing the circle of symbolic reparation. João Batista, now 55 years old, discovered in renewed adoptive fatherhood a joy he thought was lost forever. Esperança observed the interaction between him and his grandchildren with deep emotion, seeing how love had the power to multiply infinitely. The third child, João, was born in September 1893, receiving the family patriarch's name. At 59 years old, João Batista played on the floor with the children as if he were a 30-year-old man, renewed by the young energy that had transformed his house into a true home again. During those years, Esperança also dedicated time to writing, documenting her experiences in a work she called Memoirs of a Rejected Girl, Letters to the Families Who Didn't Want Me. The book, published in Salvador in 1892, caused a sensation by addressing with frankness the problems of adoption and social prejudices of the era. The letters weren't vengeful, but mature reflections on how prejudice and lack of understanding could waste valuable human potential. Esperança wrote with generosity, even about the families that had rejected her, analyzing the social circumstances that led them to make those decisions. The book was adopted as required reading in several colleges in the capital, and Esperança began receiving letters from readers throughout the country. Many were from people who identified with her story, others from families considering adoption who wanted guidance on how to do it successfully. The estate school grew and became a regional reference. In 1894, Esperança had taught more than 100 children in the region to read and write, and many of them got better jobs or continued studying in the capital. The project began being replicated on other estates, creating an informal network of progressive rural education. João Batista, observing all this at 60 years old in 1894, reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a casual encounter under a fig tree. The girl rejected 7 times had become an influential woman, respected writer, exemplary mother, happy wife, and mainly, the daughter who had returned meaning to his existence. During the nights of insomnia that still occasionally visited him, João Batista no longer tormented himself with past losses. Instead, he contemplated the abundance of the present, children's laughter echoing through the house, intelligent conversations at the dinner table, ambitious projects being realized, the sensation that his life had served a greater purpose than he had ever imagined. Esperança, now mother of 3 children, and with a solid marriage, looked back and saw her journey, not as a sequence of rejections followed by a miracle, but as a necessary process that had prepared her to recognize and value true love when it finally arrived. How would this family, built on the foundations of mutual understanding, face the final challenges that life still reserved? The years between 1895 and 1898 brought golden stability to the Santa Esperança estate. The property prospered under the shared administration of João Batista, Esperança, and Carlos, who had created a family management model that combined tradition and innovation. The workers enjoyed conditions superior to most estates in the region, with free medical care, education for their children, and participation in harvest profits. Esperança, now 33 years old, had established herself as one of the most influential women in the Recôncavo Bahiano. Her school served more than 200 children, and she had founded an association of rural women that promoted improvements in working families' living conditions. Her correspondence extended throughout the empire, exchanging experiences with educators and social reformers from various provinces. João Batista, at 64 years old, remained active and involved, but had begun gradually delegating more responsibilities to the couple. Not from incapacity, but from wisdom, he understood that a father's true legacy is preparing children to continue his work with autonomy and their own creativity. Afternoon talks on the veranda continued to be sacred. João Batista and Esperança maintained their daily conversations, now frequently accompanied by grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about cacao, about books, about the importance of treating all people with dignity. Antonio, at 11 years old, already showed aptitude for agriculture. Serafina, at 9, displayed musical talent inherited from the grandmother she never knew. João, at 5, was a force of nature that kept the entire house in constant movement. It was during one of those afternoons at the end of 1898 that Juan Batista confessed to Esperanza something he had been reflecting on for some time. "Do you know what I discovered, my daughter?" he said, watching the grandchildren play in the garden. "That happiness isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. For years, I chose sadness because I thought that's what the people I lost deserved from me. But you taught me that the best tribute to those we love is to continue living intensely." Esperanza held his hand, feeling it still strong despite his age. "And you taught me that family isn't who gives us birth, but who chooses us every day," she responded. "You chose me when I was just a scared girl, and you continued choosing me every day since then." That dialogue would prove prophetic. In early 1899, Juan Batista began showing signs of fatigue that went beyond natural aging. Carlos, with his medical knowledge, diagnosed heart problems that required special care and reduced activities. The news wasn't received with despair, but with the serenity of a family that had learned to face adversities with unity. Juan Batista, far from surrendering to melancholy, organized his final years as if they were a carefully planned final project. He spent 1899 meticulously documenting all aspects of estate administration, creating detailed manuals about each process, each tradition, each important relationship with suppliers and clients. It wasn't just transmission of technical knowledge, but of a life philosophy based on justice, generosity, and mutual respect. He also organized his personal memories, writing individual letters for each grandchild to be opened when they reached majority. In those letters, he shared life lessons, family stories, reflections on love, loss, and renewal. For Esperanza, he wrote a special letter that would only be delivered after his departure. During 1900, Juan Batista's condition deteriorated gradually, but with dignity. He continued participating in the estate's important decisions, maintained his veranda conversations with Esperanza, played with his grandchildren whenever his energy allowed. He refused to become a melancholic invalid, insisting on living each day with whatever fullness was possible. Esperanza's school became his special project during that final period. He spent hours conversing with children, telling stories, teaching basic arithmetic, transmitting his life philosophy through simple examples. The children adored him, and he found in those encounters a source of joy that eased physical discomforts. It was on a September afternoon in 1900, while he was on the veranda watching Antonio teach little João to identify different types of birds, that Juan Batista felt a deep peace taking hold of his chest. Esperanza was beside him, reading a poetry book. Carlos was seeing a patient in the clinic. Serafina was practicing piano in the living room. The estate was in full activity. Workers hummed among the cacao groves. Life pulsed abundantly around him. "Esperanza," he said softly, without taking his eyes off his grandchildren, "do you remember the first question you asked me under the orphanage fig tree?" She raised her eyes from the book, smiling with the memory. "I asked if your trunk was heavy, but actually you were asking about my invisible trunk, weren't you?" "Exactly. And today I can answer, it's no longer heavy. You helped me fill it with good things until the sadnesses became small compared to so many joys." That was one of the last long conversations they had. Juan Batista died 2 weeks later, on a peaceful October morning, sleeping in his favorite hammock on the veranda, surrounded by the family he had chosen and that had chosen him back. The funeral was a celebration of life more than a ritual of mourning. People from throughout the region came to pay tribute to the man who had transformed the Santa Esperanza estate into an example of just prosperity and human dignity. Esperanza spoke at the ceremony, describing Juan Batista, not as the man who had adopted her, but as the father she had been lucky to find when they both needed each other most. The letter he had left for her was read in private, on a solitary morning on the veranda, where so many confidences had been shared. The words were simple but profound, filled with the paternal love that had grown between them over 21 years. "My dear daughter Esperanza, if you are reading this letter, it's because I completed my journey in this life. Don't be too sad. I lived much more than I deserved, and much better than I dreamed possible after the losses I suffered. You saved me as much as I saved you. When I found you in that orphanage, I was a dead man who still breathed. You returned me to life, not just by giving me purpose, but by teaching me that love can be reborn in unexpected ways. Take care of the estate, but mainly take care of the family we built. Teach your children that family is more than blood. It's daily choice, it's mutual care, it's love that isn't measured but multiplied. You were the most precious daughter any father could desire." I hope I was the father you deserved. With all my eternal love, your father forever, Juan Batista. Esperanza carefully folded the letter and placed it in her mother's trunk, beside Rosa's memories. Now she had two inheritances of love to keep, two examples of how true affection transcends conventions and creates indestructible bonds. How would Esperanza honor João Batista's memory and continue the legacy of love and dignity they had built together? The year 1901 brought Esperanza the responsibility of leading alone the property she had helped transform. At 35 years old, widowed of her adoptive father, she found herself in the position of matriarch of a family that included not only Carlos and their 3 children, but also the entire community that depended on the Santa Esperanza estate. The transition was smoothed by the fact that João Batista had spent years preparing her for this moment. Esperanza knew every aspect of the estate's functioning, maintained solid relationships with all workers and their families, and had developed a network of commercial contacts who respected her competence regardless of her gender. Benedito Livre, now over 60 years old, became her right hand in practical administration. Florinda, who had married one of Benedito's sons, took over school coordination, allowing Esperanza to dedicate herself to expanding the educational project to other estates in the region. The first important decision Esperanza made alone was creating a support fund for working families, financed with a percentage of the estate's profits. The fund offered interest-free loans for housing improvements, assistance in cases of illness or accident, and study scholarships for the most promising young people to continue their education in the capital. Carlos fully supported Esperanza's initiatives, both for agreeing with her philosophy and for recognizing that her administrative competence surpassed his own. He concentrated on medical work, expanding care to increasingly distant communities, while she handled property management and social projects. The children grew immersed in this atmosphere of meaningful work and social responsibility. Antonio, at 14 years old, already showed interest in modern agriculture, studying crop rotation techniques and seed improvement. Serafina, at 12, combined her musical talents with teaching aptitude, helping Florinda at school and organizing small recitals for estate families. João, at 8 years old, followed his father's footsteps, showing fascination with medicine and animal care. In 1902, Esperanza made a decision that surprised everyone. She decided to expand her activities beyond the estate, accepting an invitation to join Bahia Province's Education Council. She was the first woman to occupy such a position, and her appointment caused controversy in Salvador newspapers. The decision wasn't made from personal ambition, but from understanding that her ideas about rural education needed to be implemented on a larger scale to create lasting impact. Esperanza traveled monthly to Salvador, participating in meetings where she defended the creation of rural schools, training of teachers qualified for the interior and adult literacy programs. These trips also gave her opportunity to reconnect with old classmates from the Colegio da Soledade, many of whom had become influential in Bahian society. Through these connections, Esperanza obtained financial and political support for her educational projects, creating a network of progressive women working for social change. In 1903, the Santa Esperanza estate model was officially recognized by the provincial government as an example of excellence in progressive rural administration. Farmers from other regions began visiting the property to learn about innovations implemented by Esperanza, and she began being invited to lecture at agricultural and educational events. Recognition also brought responsibilities. Esperanza received proposals to advise other rural property owners, write manuals on modern agricultural management, and even run for political office. She selectively accepted invitations, always prioritizing those that allowed multiplication of practices she had developed. During this period of expanding influence, Esperanza remained faithful to principles she had learned from João Batista. She never let herself be seduced by power or prestige, always remembering that her moral authority came from having personally experienced the challenges she now tried to solve for others. Letters she received from readers of Memoirs of a Rejected Girl continued arriving, now from throughout the country and even other Latin American countries. Many related cases of successful adoptions inspired by her story. Others asked for advice on creating more humane public policies for orphaned children. In 1904, Esperanza decided to write a second book, Education as Liberation, Experiences from a Rural School. The work documented in detail the methodology developed at the estate school, offering a replicable model for other rural communities. The book became mandatory reference in teacher training courses and influenced educational policies in various provinces. Esperança's literary and professional success didn't go unnoticed by newspapers of the era, which began portraying her as a symbol of the new Brazilian woman, educated, independent, socially committed. Although she appreciated recognition, she always made a point of crediting her achievements to the education she had received and the example of dignity João Batista had given her. In her lectures, Esperança customarily told her own story as an example of how human potential can be wasted by prejudices, but also how a true opportunity can completely transform a trajectory. Her words touched audiences of all social classes because she spoke from lived experience, not abstract theories. The Santa Esperança estate, under her leadership, continued prospering economically while deepening its social commitment. In 1905, the property employed more than 300 families, all with access to school, medical care, and dignified housing. The model had become so recognized that delegations from abroad came to study it as an example of humanitarian capitalism. But for Esperança, the greatest success wasn't fame or external recognition. It was seeing at the estate's dinner table her 3 children growing as young people conscious of their social responsibilities, discussing medical and social issues of the region with Carlos, planning how they could contribute to a better future. It was observing Antonio developing more efficient agricultural techniques that benefited all workers, Serafina organizing cultural programs that brightened the community's life, João demonstrating the same compassion as his father in caring for people and animals. It was mainly keeping alive on the estate the atmosphere of dignity and love that João Batista had created, knowing that each decision she made was guided by the values he had transmitted to her during their veranda conversations. How would Esperança balance her growing public responsibilities with family care and preservation of values João Batista had taught her? The year 1906 brought the first great challenge to the legacy Esperança had built. A severe drought struck the Recôncavo Baiano, ruining plantations and creating an economic crisis that affected the entire region. Many estates went bankrupt, workers migrated en masse to cities, and the model of shared prosperity that the Santa Esperança estate represented was put to its hardest test. Esperança faced the crisis with the same practical determination that João Batista had taught her. Instead of firing workers or reducing benefits, she completely reorganized the estate's activities, diversifying crops, implementing rudimentary irrigation systems, and creating work fronts for infrastructure projects. The Family Support Fund, which she had created during prosperous years, proved its value during the drought. Accumulated resources allowed the estate to continue paying dignified wages, even with falling production, keeping united the community that could have dispersed in search of better opportunities. Carlos expanded his medical care, treating not only estate workers, but also drought refugees arriving in the region. Esperança's school temporarily transformed into a food distribution center and shelter for displaced families. It was the philosophy of solidarity that João Batista had planted being tested under the most adverse circumstances. The crisis also brought external pressures. Less understanding creditors demanded immediate payments, suppliers reduced credit terms, and some neighboring farmers suggested that Esperança was being irresponsibly generous by maintaining so many workers during an economic crisis. It was during a particularly tense meeting with representatives of the bank that financed part of the estate's operations that Esperança demonstrated the moral strength she had developed over the years. When the manager suggested she fire half the workers to reduce costs, she responded with firmness that silenced the room. "Gentlemen, this estate isn't just a business. It's a community of 300 families who depend on us not just to survive, but to live with dignity. If you believe the only way to overcome difficulties is to abandon those who trusted us, then perhaps we should reconsider our financial partnership." The declaration wasn't a bluff. Esperança had spent months discreetly negotiating with other financiers, including a group of European investors interested in sustainable models of tropical agriculture. When she presented concrete refinancing alternatives, the bank was obliged to accept her conditions. The solution to the crisis came through a combination of innovation and persistence. Antonio, now 19 years old and graduated in agronomy, developed drought-resistant cultivation techniques that were pioneering in the region. Esperanza used her political connections to secure government investments in water infrastructure. Carlos organized preventive health campaigns that reduced the community's medical costs. But the most significant contribution came from an unexpected source: the workers themselves. During a general assembly convened by Esperanza to discuss the estate's situation, they spontaneously organized to propose temporary reductions in their salaries in exchange for the guarantee that no one would be fired. The proposal deeply moved Esperanza, who rejected the salary reductions but was touched by the demonstration of loyalty and community spirit. It was proof that the management model based on mutual respect had created genuine bonds between employers and employees. Recovery from the drought coincided with important changes in the family. Antonio married in 1907 to Clara, daughter of a progressive farming family, bringing to the estate a daughter-in-law who shared the family values. Serafina, at 18 years old, was accepted at the Salvador Music Conservatory, fulfilling artistic dreams that João Batista had encouraged since her childhood. João, at 13 years old, showed increasing interest in medicine, accompanying Carlos on his patient visits and displaying natural aptitude for diagnosis and care. It was as if each child had inherited a different aspect of the family legacy: Antonio, the administrative competence; Serafina, the cultural sensitivity; João, the vocation to serve others. In 1908, 5 years after João Batista's death, Esperanza made a decision that symbolized her maturity as a leader. She decided to erect a monument in his memory at the center of the estate, not a pompous statue, but a community library that would be open to all families in the region. The João Batista de Almeida Library was inaugurated in a moving ceremony that brought together hundreds of people. Esperanza spoke about how books had been fundamental in her own education and how access to knowledge was the best legacy they could leave for future generations. The initial collection included not only technical books about agriculture and medicine, but also literature, poetry, history, philosophy. Esperanza wanted the estate's children to have access to the same type of humanistic education she had received, breaking barriers between practical education and cultural formation. The library quickly became a center of intellectual activity in the region. Esperanza organized weekly lectures on various topics. Carlos offered first aid classes. Antonio taught modern agricultural techniques. Gradually, the Santa Esperanza estate transformed into a radiating center of knowledge and culture. The library's success attracted national attention. Newspapers from various capitals sent reporters to document how an estate in interior Bahia had created an innovative model of integrated rural development. Esperanza became even better known, receiving invitations to lecture at universities and participate in international congresses. But fame never diverted her from her central purpose. In her intimate correspondence with old school classmates, she always returned to the same themes: the importance of creating opportunities for those who didn't have them, education's transformative power, and the responsibility of those who had privileges to use their position to benefit others. It was evident that Esperanza had become much more than the girl rejected 7 times. She was now a force for social transformation, living proof that human potential can flourish under the most unlikely circumstances when it finds adequate soil to grow. How would Esperanza face new challenges that her growing influence and the country's social transformations would bring to her life and mission? In 1910, when Esperanza turned 44 years old, her influence had transcended the borders of the Santa Esperanza estate and even Bahia. Invited by the federal government to integrate a national commission on rural education, she found herself at the center of debates that would define public policies for the entire country. The trip to Rio de Janeiro, then the federal capital, was her first experience outside the Northeast. Accompanied by Carlos, who would take advantage to participate in medical congresses, Esperanza carried in her luggage not only her ideas, but also the confidence to represent thousands of rural families who rarely had a voice in government decisions. In the commission, Esperanza encountered initial resistance from some members who questioned the presence of a woman, especially one from interior Bahia. But her technical competence, grounded in 20 years of practical experience, quickly earned respect. Her proposals for creating integrated rural schools, training specialized teachers, and adult literacy programs were incorporated into the Commission's final report. During her stay in Rio, Esperanza reconnected with some old classmates from the Colegio da Soledade who had married influential politicians and intellectuals of the capital. Through these connections, she met Rui Barbosa, Joaquim Nabuco, and other intellectual leaders of the era, discussing with them issues about education, women's rights, and social justice. Those conversations further expanded her vision of the country's challenges. Esperanza realized that the problems she faced in Bahia were repeated in all regions, and that solutions developed at the Santa Esperanza estate could be adapted for different geographical and cultural contexts. Back at the estate, she found developments that filled her with pride. Antonio had implemented a cacao genetic improvement program that was significantly increasing productivity. Serafina, graduated from the conservatory, had returned to direct a cultural program that included monthly concerts, theatrical pieces, and literary soirees that attracted audiences from throughout the region. João, now 17 years old, had been accepted at the Bahia Faculty of Medicine, following in his adoptive father's footsteps. His departure for Salvador moved the entire family, but especially Carlos, who saw in the young man the continuity of his commitment to social medicine. Changes weren't limited to the family. The Santa Esperanza estate had become such a recognized model that it received visits from international delegations interested in studying sustainable methods of tropical agriculture. Esperanza was surprised to discover that her experience was seen as pioneering even in Europe and the United States. In 1912, she made the most ambitious decision of her career, creating the João Batista de Almeida Rural Education Institute, an organization dedicated to training teachers specialized in agricultural communities. The institute would occupy property adjacent to the estate and offer intensive courses for educators from throughout the country. The project required considerable investment, but Esperanza had learned from João Batista the importance of dreaming big when dreams serve the common good. She mobilized her network of contacts, secured government support, and organized a fundraising campaign that surprised everyone with its results. The institute's inauguration in 1913 was a national event. Ministers, governors, intellectuals, and journalists from throughout the country attended the ceremony. Esperanza, addressing an audience of more than 1,000 people, recalled her own journey from the orphanage to that moment, emphasizing that each individual achievement should serve to open paths for others. Every educated person, she said on that occasion, carries the responsibility to be a ladder so others can climb. It's not enough to reach high places. We must extend our hand to those still below. The institute began functioning with 60 students in the first class, selected from candidates from 15 different provinces. The program included not only teaching methodologies, but also basic agriculture, notions of rural medicine, community organization, and local leadership development. Esperanza personally assumed academic coordination, developing a curriculum that combined educational theory with immersive practice. Students spent mornings in classrooms and afternoons working directly with estate families, learning to connect formal education with daily reality. The institute's success was immediate. The first graduates returned to their regions of origin, implementing rural schools based on the Santa Esperanza estate model. Soon, an informal network of progressive educators spread throughout the country, all connected by the educational philosophy Esperanza had developed. During this period of intense professional activity, Esperanza remained attentive to family life. Antonio and Clara had their first child in 1914, a boy who received the name João Batista in honor of his adoptive great-grandfather. Esperanza, becoming a grandmother for the first time at 48 years old, discovered in the experience a renewed joy that echoed the feelings João Batista himself had expressed when living with his grandchildren. Serafina married in 1915 to an Italian conductor who had come to Brazil to direct symphony orchestras, establishing herself in Salvador, but maintaining constant connection with the estate. João, standing out as a medical student, was specializing in tropical medicine, preparing to return to the interior and continue the work begun by Carlos. World War I, which broke out in Europe in 1914, brought unexpected repercussions for Brazil and the estate. European demand for cacao increased dramatically, generating economic prosperity that Esperanza channeled entirely toward expansion of social and educational projects. In 1916, she made a decision that would mark her maturity as a social thinker, writing her third book, The Republic of Workers: Experiences in Rural Democracy. The work analyzed how workers' active participation in estate decisions had created a governance model that could inspire broader social reforms. The book generated controversy for its advanced ideas about labor rights and democratic participation, but also consolidated Esperanza's reputation as one of the most original social thinkers of her generation. Brazilian and foreign universities began inviting her for lectures, offering her honorary titles and academic positions, but Esperanza remained faithful to her origins. Every morning, she continued walking through the estate, talking with workers, checking the school's functioning, monitoring project progress. Every afternoon, she sat on the same veranda where she had conversed with João Batista, now often accompanied by grandchildren, who grew up hearing the same stories about dignity, work, and love that she herself had heard decades before. How would Esperanza face the approaching political and social transformations, keeping alive the values she had learned from João Batista in a constantly changing world? The years between 1917 and 1920 brought profound changes for Brazil and the world, testing the resistance of values Esperanza had built over decades. The Russian Revolution, the end of World War I, and social transformations sweeping the country created a context of political uncertainties that affected even the apparently tranquil interior of Bahia. The Santa Esperança estate faced its second major challenge when a general strike of rural workers hit the region in 1918. Union movements, influenced by socialist ideas from Europe, questioned traditional relationships between bosses and employees, demanding radical changes in working conditions. Esperanza, now 52 years old, found herself in a delicate position. On one hand, she had always defended advanced labor rights. On the other, she saw her estate being attacked by union leaders who didn't understand the cooperative model she had developed over the years. The situation became complicated when external agitators arrived in the region, preaching the need to destroy paternalistic capitalism, represented by farmers like Esperanza. Some younger workers, influenced by these speeches, began openly questioning the Almeida family's authority. It was then that an episode occurred that would forever define the relationship between Esperanza and her community. During a tumultuous assembly called by the Unionists, she asked for the floor and, standing before hundreds of workers, many of whom she had known since childhood, made one of the most important speeches of her life. "My friends," she began, with a calm but firm voice, "you have known me for 20 years. You've seen how this estate evolved, how your families prospered, how your children were educated. I don't ask you to trust me out of gratitude, but to judge by the results we built together." She continued, explaining that true revolution wasn't about destroying what worked, but expanding just models to other properties. She proposed that the workers themselves oversee the estate's management, creating elected commissions that would accompany all administrative and financial decisions. The proposal surprised both unionists and workers. Esperanza was offering a level of transparency and participation that went beyond what the union movements themselves demanded. Benedito Livre, now the community's respected patriarch, was the first to publicly support the proposal. "This woman," he said, with the authority of someone who had known the estate since João Batista's time, "never lied to us, never exploited us, always treated us like family. If she's offering more participation in decisions, it's because she believes we're capable of assuming those responsibilities." The assembly ended with unanimous approval of Esperanza's proposal. External unionists, frustrated by not managing to awaken revolt in a community that felt valued, left in search of more promising territories for their revolutionary preaching. The experience strengthened even further the bonds between Esperanza and the estate's workers. The oversight commissions became permanent bodies that effectively contributed to management improvements. Complete transparency of the estate's accounts created a shared administration model that would be studied by economists and sociologists from various universities. During that turbulent period, the family also faced significant changes. Carlos, at 65 years old, began reducing his medical activities, gradually passing his responsibilities to João, who had returned from Salvador, graduated in medicine and specialized in public health. João brought with him modern ideas about preventive medicine and community health, implementing vaccination programs, basic sanitation, and health education that made the Santa Esperança estate a model of rural health for the entire country. His arrival represented the third generation of the family, assuming responsibilities on the property. Antonio, now 33 years old, had become one of the most respected agronomists in the region, developing innovative techniques that significantly increased productivity without compromising environmental sustainability. His wife, Clara, had established herself as coordinator of the estate's social programs, continuing the assistance work that Tia Firmina had begun decades earlier. Serafina, although living in Salvador, maintained constant connection with the estate through cultural programs she organized during school vacations. Her concerts and theatrical spectacles attracted audiences from throughout the region, consolidating the Santa Esperanza estate's reputation as a center of cultural irradiation. The eldest grandson, João Batista Neto, turned 10 in 1920, growing up on an estate where it was common to see international delegations studying sustainable agriculture methods, university professors researching innovative educational models, and journalists documenting experiences of rural democracy. For the boy, that extraordinary reality was just normality. He grew up playing with workers' children, learning Portuguese and French simultaneously, since many foreign visitors frequented the estate, and naturally absorbing the values of equality and mutual respect that defined the family environment. In 1920, when the estate completed 40 years under Almeida family management, Esperanza organized a grand celebration that brought together hundreds of people, including former workers who had moved to other regions but maintained effective bonds with the property. During the festival, she inaugurated a special project, a museum dedicated to the estate's history and the families who built it. The collection included photographs, documents, personal objects, and oral testimonies that told the trajectory from Juan Batista's times to that moment. In the museum's main room, in a place of honor, was displayed the trunk Esperanza had brought from the orphanage, now surrounded by adoption documents, letters exchanged with Juan Batista, photographs of the growing family, and newspaper clippings documenting the property's evolution. "This trunk," she said during the inauguration, "represents the power of things kept with love. My mother Rosa kept in it the memories of a simple but dignified life. I kept in it nostalgia and hope. Today, it holds proof that love can transform any story." The museum became a mandatory visiting point for delegations studying the estate's model, contributing to even wider dissemination of ideas developed there. Esperanza had understood that preserving memory was fundamental to guarantee that built values would survive time's inevitable changes. How would Esperanza prepare the new generation to continue the estate's legacy in a world changing ever more rapidly? In 1925, when Esperanza turned 59 years old, an unexpected event brought to light revelations that would forever change her understanding of her own history. The arrival of a letter addressed to Mrs. Esperanza de Almeida Santos, daughter of Rosa dos Santos, from Lisbon, Portugal, triggered a series of discoveries that left her deeply moved. The letter was signed by Miguel Santos, who identified himself as the younger brother of Manuel dos Santos, the biological father Esperanza had always believed had abandoned her. Miguel explained that only recently had he discovered the existence of a niece in Brazil, through an article about the Santa Esperanza estate published in a European magazine highlighting innovative experiences in social agriculture. The revelations contained in the letter were surprising. Manuel dos Santos hadn't abandoned Rosa from lack of love or responsibility, but because he had been forced to return urgently to Portugal due to his parents' sudden death and the need to assume family businesses. He had left sufficient money for Rosa and their daughter, plus a letter explaining the situation and promising to return as soon as possible. According to Miguel, Manuel had tried to return to Brazil in 1875, but discovered that Rosa had died of cholera and that their daughter had disappeared without a trace. He had spent years searching for Esperanza through investigation agencies, but without success. The orphanage's bureaucracy and constant family changes had completely erased her trail. Even more moving was the information that Manuel dos Santos had become a prosperous merchant in Lisbon, always maintaining hope of finding his daughter. He had married and had other children, but never forgot Rosa or stopped searching for Esperanza. Miguel reported that Manuel had died in 1920, but had left a specific testament destining part of his inheritance to his Brazilian daughter, should she be found. The letter included copies of documents proving all this information: birth certificates, marriage certificates, wills, receipts from investigation agencies, and even the original letter Manuel had written to Rosa before departing for Portugal, a letter that never reached its destination due to postal problems of the era. Esperanza read and reread the correspondence with tears in her eyes, understanding that her personal story was much more complex than she had always imagined. She hadn't been abandoned by an irresponsible father, but separated from a family by tragic circumstances no one had been able to control. The revelation brought contradictory feelings. On one hand, joy at discovering she had been loved by a father she never knew. On the other, sadness knowing Manuel had died without managing to find her again. And mainly, a strange sensation that her identity was being rewritten at 59 years of age. Carlos and the children received the news with mixed emotion. They understood the importance of these revelations for Esperanza, but also feared they might somehow diminish the value of the family they had built together. Esperanza soon perceived this concern and tried to clarify it. Discovering that my biological father loved me doesn't diminish at all the love João Batista gave me, she explained during a family meeting on the veranda where so many important conversations had taken place. It just makes me understand I was blessed by two fathers, one who conceived me with love but couldn't raise me, and another who chose me and raised me with all the love in the world. Correspondence with Miguel dos Santos intensified over the following months. Fair Esperanza discovered she had 5 half-siblings in Portugal, all prosperous merchants and liberal professionals who had grown up hearing stories about the lost Brazilian sister. They sent photographs, letters, accounts about the father she had never known. What touched her most was discovering that Manuel had kept a photograph of Rosa until the end of his life, and that his final records included notes about searches for his Brazilian daughter. It was evident she had constantly occupied his thoughts over decades. Miguel proposed a trip to Brazil to personally meet the Brazilian family, an invitation Esperanza accepted with emotion, but also some apprehension. How would it be to meet a biological family at nearly 60 years of age, after building an entire life based on a different narrative about her origins? The visit happened in October 1925, coinciding with the Santa Esperanza estate's anniversary. Miguel arrived accompanied by 2 of Manuel's younger sons, men in their early 40s who had genuine curiosity about the Brazilian sister who had become famous in Europe through articles about social agriculture. The encounter was moving, but not dramatic. Esperanza received her half-siblings with the hospitality she had learned from João Batista, introducing them to the estate, the Brazilian family, and the community she had helped build. They were impressed by the property's prosperity and harmony, understanding that their sister had built something remarkable in Brazil. During the 2 weeks they spent on the estate, the Portuguese brothers got to know deeply Esperanza's Brazilian reality. They attended classes at the school, participated in meetings with workers, observed the rural education institutes functioning, met grandchildren who were growing up as energetic little Brazilians full of dreams. Miguel confessed he had arrived in Brazil, thinking of convincing Esperanza to visit Portugal, perhaps even establish herself there to know her European roots. But he soon realized she was deeply rooted in Brazilian soil, that her identity was indissolubly linked to the estate and community she had helped create. "You're more Brazilian than Portuguese," he told her during a veranda conversation, admiring the sunset over the cacao groves. "And you built here a life anyone would envy. Our father would be proud to see how you transformed the pain of his absence into strength to help so many people." The most moving revelation of the visit was when Miguel gave Esperanza a special gift, the diary Manuel had kept during all the years he searched for her. The pages documented dreams, hopes, frustrations, and mainly a loving persistence that never faded. Esperanza spent nights reading the notes of the father she had never known, discovering he had imagined finding her married, with children, prosperous and happy, exactly as she was. It was as if his paternal dreams had been realized through a distance he had never managed to cross physically. When the Portuguese brothers departed, they took with them not just memories of a rediscovered sister, but also literal and figurative seeds of the Brazilian experience. Miguel promised to implement on his Portuguese properties some of the agricultural and social techniques he had observed at the Santa Esperanza estate. For Esperanza, the family reunion experience represented a final piece of her identity puzzle. She finally understood that her journey hadn't been marked only by rejections and a saving adoption, but also by a distant paternal love that had never been extinguished. The discovery brought peace to questions she didn't even know bothered her. knowing she had been wanted and searched for by Manuel dos Santos, unexpectedly completed the healing of old wounds. She wasn't just the rejected girl who had found a home. She was also the beloved daughter who had been lost through tragic circumstances and rediscovered through recognition of her achievements. How would these revelations about the past influence Esperanza's decisions about the future of the estate and the family she had built? The 1930s arrived, finding Esperanza in a position of serenity that combined accumulated wisdom with still vigorous energy for new projects. At 63 years old, she had finally found peace with all dimensions of her personal history, from childhood rejections to revelations about her biological father, through the transformative love she had received from Juan Batista. The Santa Esperanza estate had become more than a prosperous property. It was a national symbol of how agriculture could reconcile economic prosperity with social justice. The Rural Education Institute had trained more than 500 teachers who disseminated throughout the country pedagogical methods developed there. The community library served thousands of people annually. The participatory management model influenced political debates about democracy and labor rights. But Esperanza's greatest pride was in the family that had grown around her. Antonio, now 43 years old, directed agricultural operations with competence that rivaled any professional administrator. Clara coordinated social programs benefiting more than 1,000 families. Their children, João Batista Neto, now 20 years old, and the twins Rosa and Manuel, 16, grew up prepared to assume responsibilities in the family's fourth generation. Serafina, definitively established in Salvador after her Italian husband's death, returned regularly to direct cultural programs that had transformed the region into a center of artistic irradiation. João, graduated in tropical medicine, had specialized in international public health and divided his time between the estate and humanitarian missions in other countries. Carlos, at 85 years old, remained lucid and active, dedicating himself mainly to training young doctors who came to practice at the estate. His experience in rural medicine had become a reference for international organizations working in developing regions. In 1932, Esperanza made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced her intention to write her complete memoirs, documenting not only her personal journey, but also the social transformations she had witnessed and helped promote over more than 50 years. The project would be more ambitious than her previous books. Esperanza wanted to create a work that would simultaneously serve as autobiography, historical analysis of Brazilian rural transformations, practical manual of social agricultural management, and mainly, testimony about love's transformative power in its multiple dimensions. Research for the book took her back to the Nossa Senhora das Mercês orphanage, now directed by a new generation of nuns who knew her story and received her as an institutional heroine. Walking through the same corridors where she had spent 5 years of uncertainty, Esperanza reflected on how that experience of rejection had been fundamental for developing her empathy for the excluded. She reconnected with some of the nuns who had known her as a child, now elderly but still lucid. Mother Joaquina had died, but had left detailed notes about each child who passed through the orphanage, including perceptive observations about Esperanza that revealed how her special personality was already perceptible in childhood. The orphanage visit confirmed a decision Esperanza had been maturing, creating a foundation dedicated to responsible adoption and support for adoptive families. Using part of the inheritance received from Manuel dos Santos, she established a permanent fund offering psychological guidance, financial support, and technical accompaniment for families interested in adoption. The João Batista and Rosa dos Santos Foundation was inaugurated in 1933 in a ceremony that brought together government authorities, intellectuals, and mainly dozens of families who had experienced successful adoption processes inspired by Esperanza's story. The foundation's work quickly expanded to other states, creating a support network that revolutionized adoption methods in the country. Esperanza had transformed her personal experience of rejection and acceptance into a system that would help thousands of children find true families. During research for her memoirs, Esperanza also tracked what had happened to the 7 families that had rejected her in childhood. She discovered most had faced various difficulties, bankruptcies, illnesses, separations, and that some had eventually regretted not giving true opportunity to the girl they could have loved. Instead of resentment, Esperanza felt compassion. She understood those families had been limited by prejudices and fears of their era, and that their inability to welcome her didn't represent personal malice, but social and cultural limitations she herself had spent her life trying to transform. In 1934, when she turned 68 years old, Esperanza finished The Trunk of Memories, A Life of Rejections and Acceptances, a work of more than 500 pages that immediately became a classic of Brazilian memoir literature. The book was translated into various languages and influenced studies on adoption, rural education, and social transformation in several countries. But the most exciting moment of that year was the birth of her first great-grandchild, son of João Batista Neto, and his young wife Maria, a teacher trained by the Estates Institute. The baby received the name Carlos João, simultaneously honoring the great-grandfather doctor and the adoptive great-great-grandfather. Esperanza, holding the great-grandchild in her arms on the same veranda where she had conversed with João Batista decades before, reflected on life's extraordinary continuity. That child would grow up in the fifth generation of a family that had begun with an improbable adoption, on an estate that had become a world model, in a community built on values of dignity and mutual love. At the end of 1935, during a special family meeting called to discuss the estate's future, Esperanza made an announcement everyone expected, but that still moved them deeply: her decision to gradually transfer property administration to the new generation, remaining as advisor, but allowing Antonio and João to assume executive responsibilities. "This estate was never my personal property," she said, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, on the veranda where so many important decisions had been made. "It was always a collective project, a dream João Batista planted, and that all of us watered with work and love. Now it's time for you to lead this dream toward the future." The transition was smooth because it had been prepared over years. Esperanza maintained her residence on the estate, continued coordinating the Foundation and Education Institute, but freed herself from daily administrative responsibilities that had occupied her mornings since youth. That freedom allowed her to dedicate herself intensively to a final project, creating a historical archive documenting not only the Santa Esperanza estate's evolution, but also the social transformations of the Recôncavo Baiano during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The archive included thousands of photographs, documents, letters, administrative records, oral testimonies, and personal objects telling the story not only of the Almeida family, but of hundreds of working families who participated in building that unique social model. In December 1936, during commemorations of the 57 years since Esperanza's arrival at the estate, the João Batista de Almeida Memory Center was inaugurated, installed in a building specially designed to house the historical archive and receive researchers from around the world. At the inauguration ceremony, Esperanza gave what would be her last great public speech. Before an audience of more than 1,000 people, including government authorities, international intellectuals, and estate workers, she summarized in simple but profound words the learning of an entire lifetime. "I learned that love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision. João Batista decided to love me when I was just a scared girl. I decided to love this land and this community when I could have chosen easier paths. You decided to love this project when you could have settled for less. True love is always a conscious daily choice we make, despite difficulties and because of possibilities." She ended the speech returning to the object that symbolized her journey, her mother's small trunk, now preserved as the museum's centerpiece. "This trunk taught me that life's most important things aren't what we possess, but what we keep in our hearts. My mother Rosa kept in it memories of a simple but dignified life. I kept in it nostalgia and hope. Now it holds proof that love can transform any story, no matter how difficult its beginning." Esperanza lived her final years surrounded by the extended family she had helped create, in a prosperous community that was living testimony to her convictions, developing projects that would perpetuate her ideas far beyond her individual existence. She died peacefully in 1940, at 74 years old, on the same veranda where she had first conversed with João Batista, surrounded by 4 generations of biological and affective descendants who carried within themselves the values she had transmitted through vivid example. Her funeral brought together thousands of people from throughout the country, but the most moving tribute came from estate workers, who carried her coffin on their shoulders, singing the same chants she used to hear during harvests, in a farewell that celebrated a life dedicated entirely to love in action. Esperanza was buried in the estate's chapel beside João Batista, Serafina, and Antonio, symbolically completing the family that death hadn't managed to separate. Her headstone bore only a simple inscription, chosen by herself. Here rests Esperanza de Almeida Santos, daughter, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, educator, and mainly, woman who transformed rejection into love. The Santa Esperanza estate continued prospering under subsequent generations' administration, remaining faithful to principles established by João Batista and developed by Esperanza. The Rural Education Institute trained thousands of teachers. The Adoption Foundation helped tens of thousands of children find families, and the participatory management model influenced public policies throughout the country. But Esperanza's true legacy wasn't in the institutions she created or books she wrote. It was in living proof that true love has the power to heal wounds, transform lives, and create futures that seemed impossible. A girl rejected 7 times had become a family's matriarch, a community's leader, and an example for the country of how human dignity can flourish when it finds adequate soil to grow. And so, on an estate in interior Bahia, under the perfume of blooming ipe trees and the song of bem-TV birds in the garden, love had once again proven its infinite capacity to transform stories, no matter how difficult their beginning.